Minister of Finance.
Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland delivered her second budget. This one characterized as a post-pandemic one, as she told the House of Commons.
We bent, but we did not break.
For Indigenous people, there is $11 billion over 6 years in new spending, which is on top of $18 billion committed in last year's budget. The Liberals said affordable housing for Indigenous people would be a major part of this budget. Building on past investments, Budget 2022 proposes $4 billion over 5 years, $2.4 billion over 5 years to support First Nations housing on reserves, $565 million over 5 years to support housing in First Nations self-governing and modern treaty holders communities, $845 million over 7 years to support housing in Inuit communities, and $190 million over 7 years for housing in Métis communities. There are several measures in the budget that intend to address the shameful legacy of residential schools. $209.8 million over 5 years will go to Crown Indigenous Relations to increase the support provided to communities to document, locate, and memorialize burial sites at former residential schools, to support the operations of a new building for the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and to ensure the complete disclosure of federal documents related to residential schools. Other highlights include $4 billion to ensure First Nations children continue to receive the support they need through Jordan's Principle, $268 million in 2022-23 to continue to provide high-quality health care in remote and isolated First Nations communities on reserve, and to accelerate the end of long-term drinking water advisories. $398 million over 2 years starting in 2022-23 to Indigenous Services Canada to support community infrastructure on reserve. And finally, $29.6 million to support self-determined action in addressing Indigenous people's climate priorities. During a press conference with journalists, Freeland was asked why the amount slated for Indigenous housing was only a tenth of what the Assembly of First Nations is asking for. She had this to say.
In this budget, the very highest spending area is the green transition. I think no one can disagree with that. The second highest area of spending is reconciliation. Over the fiscal framework, second highest reconciliation.
Advocates for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls likely won't be happy with this budget. Last year's had a whole section on MMIWG and $2.2 billion in spending over 5 years. However, this year there is a Safe and Inclusive Communities chapter with $539 million in new funds over 5 years for women and gender equality in Canada. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.